If you're using a distant light and you'd like to get soft shadows, one way to go about doing this is use the spinning light trick. I thought we'd go ahead and set that up. I'm going to use this light. It's the default distant light when you load up a new scene. And let's zero this out at the origin. So I'm going to come down here to position and 0, 0, 0. Y for rotate, 0, 0, 0. Okay? And now we've got it keyframed here at the origin. I'm going to go ahead and build the light rig. So let's zoom in just so we can see a little bit more of what we're doing. And to set up the light rig, I'm going to use two nulls. I'm going to select the first null. I'm going to create the first null, add null, and let's do light, and we'll call this spin. Okay, and then we got our null sitting there at the origin. And add null, this one is going to be our master null. This is going to move everything around. So master. And I'm going to go ahead and just to make it different than the standard starburst here, I'm going to change it to ball. Okay, and then that way it's easier to see which one we're working with, not just by name, but just by visually looking at it. So now all we have to do is parent this stuff together. So I'm going to select the light, and I'm going to parent that to the spin null. So M for motion options, parent item, and spin. Then I'm going to move over to the spin null, and I'm going to parent that to the master. Okay, and now I'm going to grab the master, and I can move around the entire rig. Okay, so let me zoom out. I'm rotating the master to rotate the entire rig. This is going to be really important because we're going to have to set up the spinning light, and it's going to be independent of how we're placing this. Okay, so I'm in the light view now. I hit 5 on the keyboard just as the shortcut key. Okay, and we'll do something like that. Go back to our perspective view just so we can see. There's our distant light pointing down, kind of like it was to begin with. It's at a slightly different angle. And I'm going to do a render, but I want shadows to show up. So I'm going to go over to Render, Render Globals, Ray Trace Shadows, and F9. And we can see our shadows here. If we want a closer look at our shadows, we can come up here and choose, let's choose 300%, but I can't see my shadow because I've zoomed in. Well, I can hold down Alt and click and drag, and now I can see my shadows. I need to turn on anti-aliasing before we're through here, but we can at least see that we do have harsh shadows, and if I want to soften those up, let's go ahead and do the spinning on the light. So I'll go ahead and, instead of closing this down, I'm going to go ahead and minimize it so we can come back and do some comparisons. Now we just need to spin our light. To do that, let's take advantage of our spinner null, and I'm going to move over here to frame 60, and let's go ahead and spin our null that's going to spin the light. So I don't need to spin it on heading or pitch, so I'm going to lock those off just so I don't accidentally do anything with them. And for bank, let's spin it 720 degrees. So that's going to spin twice around over 60 frames. If I scrub through, we can see that the light is spinning. Okay. Now I want it to kind of wobble so that if I were to compare in the end, if I were to compare the different frames, we wouldn't see a difference of where the light is. I'm going to zoom into the light here so that we can see as I spin it, it's really not doing anything. I mean, it's banking it, but the light direction isn't changing at all. So I want it to change a little bit. So to do that, I'm going to select the light, and on pitch, I'm just going to, let's do 1 degree so that we can just see as I rotate, it kind of wobbles. Watch the tip here of the little icon of the light. Watch how that wobbles. Okay. But instead of making it 1, I'm going to lower that, and I'm going to make it 0.5. So it's just subtle, except I just made a keyframe on 6. So I'm going to just delete that. Let me get out of my bank input field and delete motion key. Okay. And I'm going to do that on frame 0. So I'm going to 0.25. Okay, because you don't want to have it on another keyframe other than one, because you want the whole time that it's spinning for it to have this wobble effect and not have it change over time like I would have set up if I keyframed it on keyframe 6. Okay, so now it will change over time, but I don't want that. I know I set it up that way, but what I really need to do is go back to my spinner, and instead of having that keyframe on frame 60, which would change the light over these 60 frames, I'm going to select it, and I'm going to select the keyframe, and I'm going to left click and drag and move it over to frame 1, so that change is happening over one frame. Now, because it's happening over one frame, it starts off 0 degrees and rotates twice around back to where it started. So we're not going to see a difference here, but because Lightwave can use fractional keyframes, it's actually spinning in between 0 and 1, and we'll use that to our advantage. So I'm going to zoom out so we can see the light hasn't moved location or angle of where it's pointed because the master null is controlling that, but we are spinning the null. Now, because it's only happening over one frame, if we were to go and render, say, frame 30, we wouldn't see the effect. So what we really need to do is repeat that motion. So I'm going to head over to the graph editor, and we're using the bank channel. This is the keyframe. This is the second keyframe. As you can see, when I mouse over it, it says 720 degrees. I want to repeat that motion. So with that selected, I'm just going to repeat on the pre-behavior and the post. As you can see, these jagged lines, that's just going to keep going back and forth. It's going from 0 to 720 to 0 to 720 to 0 to 720. And that means that on every frame, it's like setting the keyframe. It's just repeating that motion. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and do a render of this. I'm going to go to open up the render that we had, and let's do a render of this. And I'm not seeing any difference because it's changing over one frame. I mean, I'm toggling back and forth using page up and page down on the keyboard. We see a little bit of shifting, but I'm not seeing the soft shadows that I'm after. In order to see those, we're going to need to turn on motion blur, so that the motion of the light can blur over time. So I'm going to come over to Camera, Properties, and under Anti-Aliasing, let's go ahead and choose Classic Enhanced Medium, just so we have several passes of anti-aliasing going on. And then I'm going to turn on Motion Blur. We'll just use Classic and blur length 50%. Close that down. F9. So now you can actually kind of see it shifting whenever it's rendering, but let's close this. And we have a softer shadow, but in order to really see it, let's zoom into 300% and compare. This is where you're not going to notice as much here because the shadow's getting farther away, so that's when we're really going to see it. So compare this area right here with that. Okay. Now, of course, that doesn't have anti-aliasing on, so let's do a comparison with anti-aliasing. So I'm going to go back to the camera properties, and I'm going to turn motion blur off, but I'm going to leave the anti-aliasing on. Let's compare apples to apples here. So I'll do a render. Has just as many passes of anti-aliasing, but no motion blur. So come over here. We can see that though we have anti-aliasing, we don't have the soft shadow. So if I page up to go to the last render, we have the soft shadow. Okay, this is without motion blur, and this is with motion blur. So that's the setup for doing the spinning light trick. Now, you can blur it more. You can have more passes of anti-aliasing. You can offset, if you, instead of angling the light 0.5 degrees, you can offset it more, which is going to spread out the shadows a little bit more, and play with the setup. But this is the basic setup of a spinning light trick. If you wanted to, you could do an array of these lights and get a global illumination type look to work with. If you wanted to get a lot of lights around here, kind of like a dome of lights, one easy way of doing that, and then you could apply a similar setup with the spinning light trick, would be to use a feature called luxigons. let's go ahead and add it. It's kind of we're kind of going in a different direction now of just showing the spinning light trick, but it could give you some ideas of how to get an array of lights quickly that you could then do the spinning light trick to. So I'm going to move over to Modeler, and we've got our ground and our little character here, and those are split up into ground in layer 1, character in layer 2. In layer 3, let's add a dome that we can then build our lights with. So create ball, and I'm just going to create a real quick ball here. Now I don't need the whole thing because I'm just going to build like a hemisphere dome. So I'm going to get rid of all of these polygons. Hit delete. So I'm going to have each one of these polygons represent where I want a light to be. It's 75 polygons. Let's just drop those down a little bit. And I want the lights to be facing in, and it will be based off the surface normal. So I'll hit F for flip, and all of our polygons are now facing in towards our character and towards our ground. Okay, and I could select just the polygons that I want to add luxigons to, but in this case I want to add them to all polygons. And remember, in Lightwave, if nothing is selected, it assumes that everything is selected. So under Setup, Add Luxigon, it allows me to pick the light type that I want. And let's just go ahead and stick with distant light. I can go ahead and set the intensity, and if I'm going to have 75 lights all pointing in, I don't really need a high intensity. So I'm going to go with 2. I'll be happy with 2. And I can also choose the color if I want. And we'll just pick a warm color there. Okay, so I'll have 75 distant lights with an intensity of 2 and this light color right there. Okay, so now I'm ready. I'm going to go ahead and save, and I'm synchronize to layout, hop over to layout, and I have my object. But I don't have those lights. Well, I need to create them. But before I do, I don't want to forget about the fact that this is just a placeholder for lights. It's also going to be a great master controller for all of our lights, and I'll explain that in a second. But I don't want this to show up in the render. So I'm going to go to Object, Properties, turn off Self Shadow, Cast Shadow, Receive Shadow. This is under the Render tab. And I'll just make it unseen. I'm just going to turn everything off because I don't want that object to really exist. The other thing that I like to do whenever I have a light rig object like this is to go over to the scene editor and make it wireframe so that I can see right through it. It's just a placeholder. So now that I have that prepared, I'm going to go ahead and convert the luxigon information to lights. So under the Items tab, Add Lights, I'm going to choose Convert Luxigons, and it allows me to name them if I want. For now, Lux is fine, and we can change that to any name that we want. Okay, and as you can see, we just created an array of lights. Let's move it out of the way just so we can see it really easy. I'm going to select my my luxigon object, which now becomes the master controller for all those lights, meaning that if I go and I'm going to go to frame 0, if I go and rotate it, all the lights are going to rotate. Okay, if I hit T for move and move it over here, we can see that we're moving all the lights. They're all parented to that object. So some people, once they have the lights, they get rid of the object. I like to hang on to it. It's an easy way to move stuff around. Now say you want to change the intensity of these lights. You don't have to do them one at a time. You don't have to go back and say, oh, let me go change it because I didn't like the intensity. If you middle mouse click and drag and select all of them, P for properties, you can change the intensity of all the lights. You can see it affecting the background here all at the same time. Or you can do one at a time if you'd like. So with this created, you could set up a similar rig to what we did here and get more of a global illumination spinning light setup versus a directional spinning light setup. So there you go. You have two options there, which can turn into as many options as you'd like. But all you really need for the spinning light trick is this setup right here. If you don't want to go and do luxigons and set up all of this, you could just select the master null here that moves everything. It's the base of the whole light rig, and clone that, like clone hierarchy, and then move those around and place them wherever you'd like to build your light setup there. The other thing to remember is that if I got rid of everything in this scene except this light rig, I could save that off in a folder for light rigs, and then anytime I need this, if I don't want to set it up from scratch, I could always load from scene and just load up this light rig, and then I don't have to build it from scratch every time. So there you go, the spinning light trick with an easy to set up light rig.